All right, so ready to dive deep today, like really deep into the heart of corporate culture.
We're talking about it going beyond the surface, the mission statements and the value posters, to uncover those invisible forces that really shape how things work.
It's like we're about to crack the code of company life. Should we grab our decoder rings?
Absolutely. And luckily, we've got David White as our guide.
Oh, yeah. His books, Disrupting Corporate Culture and Rethinking Culture, are like our treasure maps for this deep dive.
He really challenges the traditional mainstream view of company culture, and he uses some really fascinating insights from cognitive science to explain why those old school approaches often just don't work.
Yeah, like that idea that you can just create a company culture with a catchy slogan and a ping pong table.
Exactly. That's one of the big myths we need to debunk. You can't just slap a mission statement on the wall and expect everyone to fall in line. It just doesn't work that way.
Because culture isn't a top-down thing, is it? It's more like it comes from within, from the shared experiences and beliefs of the people, right?
Yeah, precisely. White argues that it's more helpful to think of culture as a kind of reference system.
Reference system. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about that.
Think of it like an invisible operating system that's running in the background, shaping how everyone thinks and acts. It's made up of these shared beliefs, these unconscious assumptions about how the world works and how things get done.
So it's like a set of unspoken rules that everyone kind of just knows.
Exactly. White calls these shared beliefs shared dominant logics, or SDLs for short. And these SDLs, they're formed through shared experiences, especially those related to the company's history, industry, and the technologies they use.
So a company that's been around for 100 years is going to have a very different set of SDLs than a tech startup that's just finding its feet.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to understand these SDLs if you're trying to make any kind of change within an organization.
Because if you're trying to change something but you're unaware of those deeply ingrained beliefs and habits, you're probably going to hit a wall.
You'll be fighting against the current. White digs into the science behind these SDLs with this fascinating concept called embodied cognition.
Okay, embodied cognition. That sounds pretty intense. Break that down for me.
Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. It's this idea that our physical experiences, the way we interact with the world, literally shape how we think, our cognitive patterns.
So you're saying our bodies are influencing our minds.
Exactly. Think about it in the context of work. The very act of doing your job day after day shapes how you think about work, how you approach problems, becomes part of the company culture.
So it's not just the company's mission statement, it's the actual work itself, the tools they use, the processes, all of that gets baked into the culture.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
And White illustrates this with this great example from 19th century textile factories.
Oh, a historical example. I love it. Tell me more.
So in German textile factories back then, workers were actually compensated for their waiting time, even if a machine broke down.
That's interesting. I feel like most workplaces these days are all about time is money.
Exactly. But in England, textile workers were only paid for their actual output, what they produced. And this seemingly small difference, it actually reveals something really profound about how these two groups, the German workers and the English workers, viewed work itself.
So their actual physical experience, their daily reality on the factory floor, that impacted their whole worldview, their beliefs about the nature of work.
It became part of their embodied schemas, their default setting.
That's amazing. Okay, so we've talked about these shared beliefs, these SDLs, but how do we actually see them in action?
But that's where things get really interesting. White takes us inside a real company that gives the pseudonym I3. It's a fascinating case study.
Okay, so I3, what's their story?
So picture this. It's a company, kind of a spin-off from this much larger 100-year-old industrial firm. And they're trying to reinvent themselves as this nimble, innovative, 100-year-old startup.
Oh, I can relate to that. It's that tension between the old ways of doing things and this desire to innovate, to break free from the past.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's tough, right? Because the past is still there. It's in their DNA. And White's team, they start to uncover all these fascinating, sometimes hidden SDLs that are still operating at I3, these remnants of their industrial past that are shaping how they approach things.
Okay, I'm dying to know. Give me some examples. What kind of SDLs are we talking about?
Well, one that comes up a lot is this idea of firsthand knowledge. At I3, if you haven't seen it with your own two eyes, experienced it yourself, it's not considered reliable information.
Ah, so it's like, I'll believe it when I see it mentality.
Exactly. And then there's action. At I3, they're all about just doing something, anything, taking action, even if it means maybe not planning things out as thoroughly as they could.
It's a more ready, fire, aim approach as opposed to ready, aim, fire.
You got it. And then there's making the abstract tangible. For them, it's all about needing concrete data, numbers, hard facts before making any decisions.
So it's like they find comfort in those hard numbers. It's tangible, it's certain.
It all comes back to this core need for certainty and control, which makes a lot of sense given their history. In fact, one of the most prominent SDLs at I3 is certainty itself.
Huh.
And that one plays out in some pretty interesting ways.
Certainty. Well, yeah, I mean, who doesn't want a little certainty, especially at work?
Of course, it's a natural human desire.
Yeah.
But at I3, it's like this driving force. Remember, they come from this background of heavy industry where stability, predictability, those were the keys to success for decades.
Right, so that need for certainty, it's deeply ingrained in their company DNA.
Exactly. And it manifests in some pretty interesting ways, like they're very risk-averse, big on control, and they tend to rely heavily on financial metrics over other, maybe more nuanced measures of success.
Yeah, because numbers are comforting, they feel safe, predictable.
Precisely. It's like their comfort zone is built on spreadsheets rather than, say, employee morale or innovation.
Which, ironically, might be what they need to truly thrive as a company.
It's that classic innovator's dilemma. But it's hard to break free from those ingrained patterns. And get this, even the way they deal with conflict at I3 is shaped by this certainty SDL.
Really? How so? I'm always interested in how companies handle disagreements because, well, let's face, they're inevitable.
Totally. But at I3, open disagreement, it's pretty rare. It's seen as too risky, too disruptive to that sense of certainty they crave. So they've developed this culture of polite agreement in meetings, followed by, shall we say, passive resistance behind closed doors.
Oh, I've seen that before. It's like agree and commit, but with a silent asterisk.
You nailed it. And it even affects how they approach bringing in outside help, like consultants.
You mean for things like strategy, that kind of thing?
Exactly. Even when they have perfectly capable people in-house, they often default to bringing in external consultants because it feels safer, less risky.
Wow, so they'd rather pay a premium for that perceived certainty, that outside expertise.
It's like they're outsourcing their risk, their decision-making, to someone they see as having more authority.
Fascinating how these things play out. Okay, so let's say you're at I3, or any company really, and you're starting to see these invisible forces, these SDLs at work. You want to shake things up, evolve the culture. Where do you even begin?
Right. You can't just, announce that there's a new culture now.
Right, it's not like putting up a new set of values posters in the break room.
Exactly. Culture is way more fluid, more ingrained than that. It's about shifting those deeply held beliefs and habits. And to do that, White gives us two really useful frameworks, the process framework and the leadership framework.
Two frameworks. Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's start with the process framework. What's that all about?
So the process framework focuses on how you can actually shift those ingrained SDLs by changing everyday practices. It's about recognizing those unconscious habits and then intentionally putting new practices in place that can, over time, shift those underlying beliefs.
So change the habits, change the thinking.
Precisely. And the leadership framework. That one focuses more on the essential qualities that leaders need to embody in order to really drive lasting cultural change.
Okay, so what kind of qualities are we talking about?
Well, White talks about the importance of curiosity, psychological flexibility, and courage.
Those are interesting choices, not the typical leadership qualities you usually hear about. Tell me more about why those are so important.
Well, curiosity is essential because you can't change something if you're not even aware of it, right? So leaders need to be willing to ask questions, to challenge their own assumptions about how things work, and to be open to seeing things from different perspectives.
Makes sense. And what about psychological flexibility? What does that look like in practice?
It's about being adaptable, being comfortable with uncertainty, and being able to hold multiple perspectives at the same time, even if they seem contradictory. Because let's face it, cultural change, it's messy, and it rarely goes in a straight line.
Right, it's more like navigating a jungle than strolling down a well-paved road.
Exactly. You're going to encounter obstacles, unexpected detours, and then there's courage. Because it takes real guts to challenge the status quo, especially in a company like I3 with such a strong, ingrained culture.
Right, because even if people agree that change is needed, actually changing those deeply held beliefs and habits, that can be scary.
Absolutely. And leaders need to be willing to stand up for what they believe in. even when it's difficult, even when they face resistance. Because let's face it, there will always be resistance to change.
This is making me think about my own workplace, all the times we've talked about improving culture. But we never really talked about it in terms of these SDLs, these embodied beliefs. It's like you've given me a whole new lens to view it through.
And that's the power of this framework, right?
Mm.
Once you understand these dynamics, you start to see those invisible forces that are shaping behavior, and you can start to work with them instead of against them.
So it's less about trying to force a culture change from the top down and more about understanding the existing culture so you can work collaboratively to create something new.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that culture is an ongoing process, an evolution, not a destination. And frankly, that's what makes it so fascinating and so crucial to get right.
All right, so we've talked about the myths, the science behind culture, and we've even gone deep inside a real company, i3, to see how these SDLs play out in the real world.
And hopefully our listeners are starting to see how these same dynamics might be at play in their own organizations.
Absolutely. But before we wrap up, there's one more thought-provoking idea from White that I want to share. At the end of Disrupting Corporate Culture, he poses this really interesting question. Imagine hardwiring development into your bottom line.
Ooh, that's a powerful statement. It's like saying, what if we treated employee development with the same level of importance as profit or market share?
Right. It's about shifting the focus from what can you do for the company to how can the company help you grow and develop.
And not just as a nice perk, but as a core business strategy. White calls these companies deliberately developmental organizations, or DDOs for short, and they're doing some really amazing things.
CDOs. Okay, I love it. It's like they figured out that investing in your people, that's not just a feel-good thing. It's good business.
Exactly. And I think what makes DDOs so interesting is it's not just about like offering more training programs or, sending people to conferences. It's about creating a culture where growth and development, they're woven into the very fabric of how the organization operates.
So it's less about checking boxes and more about a fundamental shift in mindset.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that everyone has the potential to grow and develop, and then creating the conditions for that growth to flourish.
And White, he gives some great examples in the book of companies that are doing this really well.
Yeah, he highlights three DDOs in particular: Next Jump, Decurion, and Bridgewater. Each one's got its own unique approach, but they all share this deep commitment to fostering a culture of development.
Okay, so let's dive into those examples. Tell me about Next Jump. What are they doing that's so special?
So, Next Jump, they're a tech company, and they have this practice called feedback loops, which are way more intense than your typical, once-a-year performance review.
Oh, I've been through those. Not always the most fun or productive experience.
Tell me about it. But at Next Jump, these feedback loops, they're ongoing. It's this constant process of giving and receiving really direct, specific feedback, all aimed at helping people identify their blind spots and develop their skills.
So it's less about judging past performance and more about supporting ongoing growth.
Exactly. And then there's Decurion, which is actually a movie theater chain. They've cultivated this really amazing culture of vulnerability.
Vulnerability in the workplace. That seems kind of counterintuitive.
It might sound strange, but they've found that by encouraging their employees to really open up, to share their struggles, their mistakes, even their insecurities, it creates this incredibly powerful learning environment.
Because when people feel safe to admit they don't know something, they're more likely to ask for help, to learn from each other.
Exactly. It creates this culture of psychological safety, which is so important for growth. And then you've got Bridgewater, the hedge fund, which is known for its, radical transparency.
Radical transparency, huh? What does that look like in action?
Think like recording almost every meeting, every decision-making process, and making those recordings available to everyone in the company.
Wow, that's a whole other level of transparency.
It definitely takes some getting used to,
Yeah.
but the idea is that by making everything visible, by removing that secrecy, you create this culture of accountability and continuous learning.
Because everyone can see how decisions are made, what works, what doesn't. They can learn from each other's mistakes.
Exactly. And it goes back to that SDL we talked about earlier, that firsthand knowledge thing. At Breakwater, they take it to the extreme, giving everyone access to the information they need to learn and grow.
So we've got Next Jump with their feedback loops, Decurion with their culture of vulnerability, and Bridgewater with radical transparency. Three very different companies, three very different approaches, but they're all united by this commitment to making development a core part of their DNA.
And that's what's so inspiring, right? because it shows that regardless of your industry or your company size, it is possible to create a workplace where people feel valued, challenged, and empowered to grow.
It's about recognizing that investing in your people, that's not just the HR department's job, it's everyone's responsibility, especially the leadership team.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it all starts with that mindset shift,
Hmm.
moving away from that old top-down, control-oriented model of leadership and embracing a more collaborative, developmental approach.
Because ultimately, when people feel supported and encouraged to grow, everyone benefits. The company benefits, the employees benefit, even customers benefit because they're getting a better product or
It's
service.
a win-win-win, and I think that's a great note to end on.
I agree. So, to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into corporate culture. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
And remember, culture isn't something that just happens to you. It's something you create. So get out there, challenge those old assumptions, and start building the kind of workplace where everyone can thrive.
Thanks for listening.